Mr. President, tomorrow we celebrate the 23rd anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, the landmark civil rights legislation that will always be the highlight of my almost 40 years here in the Congress. The Americans with Disabilities Act is one of the landmark civil rights laws of the 20th century. As someone once said, a long overdue emancipation proclamation for people with disabilities. The ADA has played a huge role in making our country more accessible, in raising expectations of people with disabilities about what they can achieve at work and in life, and inspiring the world to view disability issues through the lenses of equality and opportunity. In these times, it's valuable to remember that passage of the original Americans with Disabilities Act was a robustly bipartisan effort. As the chief sponsor of the ADA here in the Senate and as the chair of the Disability Policy Subcommittee at that time, I worked very closely with both Republicans and Democrats. At that time, it was Senator Robert Dole, who was at that time was the minority leader of the U.S. Senate. We received invaluable support from President Bush, President George Herbert Walker Bush, key members of his administration, White House counsel Boyd and Gray, who just worked so hard on this, Attorney General Dick Thornburgh, who was just magnificent in his support for the Americans with Disabilities Act, Transportation Secretary Sam Skinner. Other members of Congress also played critical roles in passing the ADA. First and foremost, I would have to say Senator Ted Kennedy, who was chair of the full committee at the time, and who allowed me to take the bill through as the chair of the Disability Policy Subcommittee. Senator Orrin Hatch, who played a key role at times to make sure that we got conservatives on the same page. Representatives Tony Coelho, Steny Hoyer, Major Owens, Steve Bartlett. And I might also mention that sometimes he's not mentioned a lot because he was not here in the Senate at the time we passed it, but who put in a lot of his life's work and who was chairman of that subcommittee before I took it over. And that was Senator Lowell Weicker from Connecticut. As a matter of fact, he was the first sponsor of a comprehensive disability policy bill here in the United States Senate. And so he became a great supporter, a great personal friend of mine through all these years, and Lowell Weicker deserves a lot of credit for actually getting us focused on the issue of a civil rights, comprehensive civil rights bill addressing the issue of disability. Before the ADA, life was very different for folks with disabilities in Iowa and across the country. Being an American with a disability meant you couldn't ride on a bus because there was no lift. Not being able to attend a concert or a ball game or a movie with your family or your friends, your loved ones, because there was no accessible seating. Not even being able to cross the street in a wheelchair because there were no curb cuts. In short, being disabled in America before the ADA meant not being able to work or participate in community life. Discrimination was both commonplace and accepted. Now, since then, we've seen amazing progress. The ADA literally transformed the American landscape by requiring that architectural and communications barriers be removed and replaced with accessible features such as ramps, lifts, curb cuts, widening doorways, and anyone who's watching this right now on C-SPAN, if they put it on the mute button, you get closed captioning for the deaf and hard of hearing. More importantly, the ADA gave millions of Americans the opportunity to participate in their communities. We've made substantial progress in advancing the 4 goals of the ADA. There were 4 goals: equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. The 4 pillars of the ADA. But, Mr. President, I stand here today to remind my colleagues that we have not yet kept the promise we made 23 years ago with strong bipartisan support. We still have too many Americans with disabilities living in poverty, oftentimes in isolation and without control over the supports and services in their lives. For example, just last week, in my role as the chair of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, we concluded an investigation and issued a final report on the state of the implementation of the part of the ADA that provides for people to be able to live and receive services in integrated settings, and that prohibits people from being unnecessarily separated, isolated from their family and friends, and put in institutions or other segregated settings. What we found is disturbing. 23 years after that, and after the 1999 decision in the Olmstead case by the Supreme Court, after all that, we found that more than 200,000 working-age Americans with disabilities, many in their late teens and early 20s, remain trapped in nursing homes and institutions, separated from their families and communities, against their wishes. Again, despite the ADA, despite the 1999 Supreme Court decision in Olmstead VLC, that people with disabilities have the right to be integrated in the community, a Supreme Court decision, 1999. Our committee investigators found that only 12 states devote more than half of their Medicaid long-term care dollars to home and community-based services. And the number of working-age adults in nursing homes has actually increased by more than 30,000 over the last 5 years. This is shameful. And unfortunately, many states continue to approach community living for people with disabilities. They continue to view it as a social welfare issue and not as a civil rights issue. And again, this is a failure of vision on part of many state leaders. So how can we correct this injustice? Well, we need to clarify that under the ADA, every individual who is eligible for long-term services and supports has a federally protected right to a real choice, their choice, in where they receive these services and supports, whether in an institution or in a community. And what that means also is, at long last, Congress, we need to end the institutional bias in the Medicaid system. Right now, under Medicaid, states are required to pay for long-term services and supports if you're in a nursing home. But if you don't want to be in a nursing home and you want to receive those supports and services in an integrated community-based setting, Medicaid has the option of covering you. That's the institutional bias that exists in Medicaid. They have to pay for you if you're in a nursing home, and they don't have to pay for supports and services if you're in a community or integrated setting. As long as that remains that way, the deck will continue to be stacked in favor of costly institutional settings. And we know from our investigations that home-based, community-based, integrated settings and with support services for people with disabilities is cheaper. It's cheaper, more cost-effective than putting people in an institution or a nursing home. Not to mention the quality of life and the fact that so many people with disabilities want to be in an integrated community setting and do not want to be housed in a nursing home. I can say that in my remaining 17 months that I have as a United States Senator here in the Senate, I plan to hold hearings and introduce legislation that will accelerate the rate at which states move their long-term services and supports in the direction of home and community-based settings. Now, another area where 23 years after the passage of the ADA, our work is incomplete, is making sure people with disabilities take their rightful place in the American workforce. 23 years after the passage of the ADA, it is shameful that 2 out of every 3 adults with a disability is not even in the workforce, not working. That is shameful. You know, we say, well, the unemployment rate in America is now, 8, 7%, something like that, 9%. Think about if you're a disabled adult. It's 60% or more. unemployment. Well, next week, in the Help Committee, we will mark up the Workforce Investment Act. The Workforce Investment Act, a critical law that has not been reauthorized since 1998. Now, the workforce has changed a lot since 1998. And a lot of the ADA generation, I'll have some more to say about that in a second, have come of age during that period of time. So in the bipartisan draft that Senators Alexander and Murray and Isaacson and I filed with the committee just yesterday, we include provisions that will improve how the vocational rehabilitation system partners with schools to deliver services that will result in more young people doing internships, part-time jobs in competitive settings. The aim is to maximize the likelihood that young people with disabilities will leave school, college, and career ready. The generation of young people with disabilities graduating from high school and college today, people like Lily Siegel, who was my intern from the American Association of People with Disabilities. They provide summer internships. Lily Siegel has been my intern this summer. I tell you, Lily and so many like her have high expectations for themselves. They want to be challenged. They want to work in competitive integrated employment. They don't want to be shunted into sub-minimum wage jobs with no future, no chance for advancement, no chance for challenging themselves or to be challenged to do better and to do more and to take more responsibility. So we owe it to them to do everything in our power to help them transition to the kind of jobs and higher education experiences that will help them to build a career and maximize their economic self-sufficiency. I can tell you from my work in this area that this generation of young people that have come of age under the umbrella of the ADA, kids who were born in 1990, 91, 93, 95, they're now coming of age. They haven't been segregated. They've been integrated in their schools. They weren't segregated like my brother was and sent away halfway across the state to a state institution. And they have higher expectations. You know, they've had accessibility. They see what society has done to provide, to make sure that they can travel, they can go out with their friends and their family, they can go to school in integrated settings, they can get jobs, and the employers under the ADA have to provide reasonable accommodations for that job. They don't deserve now to be frustrated by not having the opportunity to get that competitive integrated employment. So that's what we're doing in the Workforce Investment Act, to provide for young people in high school who have disabilities, to let them know that they expect more of themselves, and we do too. We do too. No longer will it be acceptable for them just to leave school and go into some minimum wage covered employment where they are just warehoused for the rest of their lives. They want to get out there and show what they can do. And that's why we're changing the Workforce Investment Act, changing voc rehab to focus on getting these young people internships, job shadowing, mentoring, so that they know what their abilities are and what they can expect to do once they leave school. Finally, in order to preserve and leverage our global leadership in the disability arena, and I mentioned earlier that when we passed the ADA, so many people came here from other countries, legislators, parliamentarians. How can we now do this? People with disabilities from other countries, how can we get our laws changed? Well, about 11 years ago, the United Nations set up a committee to look at this. And out of this came the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the CRPD as we call it. Now that convention, that treaty was sent to our president, And under our system, the president sends it out to all his departments in the executive branch to report back what laws, what things do they need to do to change to conform to the treaty. In other words, a treaty is the supreme law of the land. What laws do we have to change in order to comply with that treaty? Guess what? After about a whole year of circulating through all of our departments of justice and labor and HHS and agriculture and everything else, came back, we don't have to change one law because we're the best in the world when it comes to the civil rights protection of people with disabilities. So we don't have to change anything. So last year, under the guidance of then Senator John Kerry, who is now our Secretary of State, it went to the Foreign Relations Committee. They had hearings. I remember that Senator McCain and I were the two lead-off witnesses. And we brought that treaty to the floor of the Senate in December, fully expecting that it would pass. And of course, under the Constitution of the United States, it requires a 2/3 vote to approve a treaty. But we thought we had the votes. We brought it on the floor. We fell 6 votes short of the 67 votes that we needed. So we had a number of Republicans and Democrats on the bill. So why did it fail? Well, towards the end, right before we brought it up, former Senator Rick Santorum and others began to talk about how this was going to prevent people from homeschooling their kids. Well, I thought I knew the treaty. I had read it. I had looked at it. I thought, did I miss something? Is there something in there that I didn't find? So I went back to my staff, was combed through this. I got a hold of the people at UN. I said, what's in here that would prevent people from homeschooling their kids? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. That charge was just made out of whole cloth somehow. But I can tell you that at that time in my office, calls ran 50-1 against adopting the treaty on that issue. So people were misinformed because of a few people, like Mr. Santorum and others, who decided to whip this up for whatever reason, I don't know. And there was also a lot of comments made on the Senate floor by my Republican colleagues at that time that we shouldn't be adopting a treaty in a lame duck session, even though we pointed out that many treaties in the past had been adopted in lame duck sessions. And so I review that history to tell my colleagues that under the leadership of Senator Bob Menendez, who is now the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I might add that the person who succeeded Senator Kerry in his position in the United States Senate, the present occupant of the chair, is also on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And there's going to be some more hearings, and we intend to bring, under Senator Menendez's leadership, we intend to bring that back to the floor this fall, and we need to get the 67 votes. We need to get the 67 votes. People say, why is that so important? It's important for the United States to take leadership on this issue around the globe. Over 100 nations have already signed the treaty. They're looking to us for leadership. And I've talked to some of my colleagues, and they said, well, why do we need to join that? We're okay, we're doing just fine. We're doing just fine with disability law in our country. We don't need to join this convention, sign this treaty. Well, it just seems to me that's an inherently selfish way of looking at who we are and what we're about as a nation. We have provided, I think, to the world guidance and direction on disability issues. If we are a part of the convention, we get a seat at the table. When countries come and say, you know, we want to conform our laws, we want to make sure that we meet the guidelines of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, this commission that's set up will be there to both guide and direct countries, but also to see whether or not they're fulfilling their obligations. if we're not a signatory to the treaty, we're not at the table. And there's another reason why we should sign this convention. I just spoke to a group of people yesterday with disabilities, and I said, you know, there are a lot of people in this country who use a wheelchair. And guess what? They'd like to travel overseas. They'd like to go with their friends and their family. But in many of these countries, they don't have curb cuts. They don't have lifts. They don't have accessibility for people with disabilities. Shouldn't people with disabilities in this country have the same right to travel and enjoy foreign travel as anybody else? Well, if we're a signatory to the treaty, then we can work with those countries to help change their laws, change their structures. Veterans. I can't tell you how many veterans I've talked to. People who have come back from Iraq and Afghanistan disabled. Disabled. And you know what they say? They want us to join the treaty too because they want to travel overseas. And they feel constricted because they won't have accessibility in other countries. For the life of me, I can't understand why people are not supporting this treaty. I don't get it. I just don't get it. It's supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's supported by every veterans group in this country. It's supported by, I think, every faith-based group in this country. It's supported by everyone in the disability community. It's supported by every former living president, from the two Bushes to Clinton to Carter. It's got broad-based support. You would think that with that kind of support, it would be a no-brainer to pass it in the Senate. So we're going to bring it up again this fall, and I'm hopeful that we can do it. You know, no one worked harder on a lot of these issues than Senator Bob Dole. We just had his 90th birthday party yesterday in Statuary Hall. It was quite an event. No, it wasn't yesterday. It was Tuesday night. Celebrated his 90th birthday. So we fell just 6 votes short. I look forward to working with Senators Menendez, McCain, Ayotte, Barrasso, Durbin, Udall, Coons, bring the treaty back to the floor, get the additional votes needed for it to pass. And I can tell you this time around, people with disabilities, their family members, supporters in the business community, veterans community, faith-based, civil rights groups are mobilizing for this. They don't want to take another chance that this won't pass. So I urge my colleagues to take the time to look at the facts related to the Disability Treaty. It requires no changes in U.S. law. It has no budget impact. As I said, when we become a party to the convention, we have a seat at the table with the rest of the world. We'll be well positioned to accelerate progress for the 1 billion people with disabilities around the world. Our chance to be that shining city on the hill for the rest of the world. I might also add that this is supported by the high-tech business community in America because their global leadership position on accessible products and services can be used by the rest of the world. So for all those reasons, we need to pass this. Let me just close with this one last thought. Again, I'm struck by the fact that these days we're surrounded, as I said earlier, by a new generation of young adults with disabilities who grew up since the passage of the ADA, including many wounded warriors back from Iraq and Afghanistan. I've called these younger people the ADA generation. They see disability as a natural part of human diversity. They reject the prejudices and stereotypes of earlier generations. And I can tell you this, they have high expectations for themselves. They want to be challenged, and they want to challenge us to make sure that our society is open, that they have the opportunity to go as far as their talents can take them. And we can't let these people down. We passed the ADA. Now we have to make sure that we take steps to make sure that it isn't just a promise, but it's a promise that we are keeping and that we will keep. We in the Senate have a responsibility to keep fighting to ensure that they have an equal opportunity to be independent, fully integrated, fully self-sufficient. That, at the heart, is what the Americans with Disabilities Act is all about. 23 years later, we can look at it and say, without doubt, it really is America at its very best.